What's really good, everybody? This is Nathan Allebach, and welcome to the podcast where we get into people's stories and go down a bunch of rabbit holes about what's really good in the world. It's been about a month since I put anything out, so this feels super weird. I got married and went on a honeymoon and got way behind on work when we got back, so I haven't had much time to really sit down and edit any of my own stuff, you know? But don't worry, I won't bore you with my life because I know none of you really care about that. You just want to hear what's really good, right? I mean, that would make sense. So we'll just jump right into it. In this episode, I got to sit down with a friend who I first met through the Twitter, who goes by Kae Lani. Kae Lani is a social and editorial producer at USA Today 10 Best and the co-founder to the network's newest venture, Eat, Sip, Trip. She's been featured in Billboard, Fodor's Travel, Budget Travel, and Yahoo for her work. And I'm sure, as you can tell from the title, we covered a ton on the topic of cultural appropriation when it comes to food specifically. We got into the history of the term and shared social criticisms and talked about specific cases happening in the media, like how when a topic like this becomes boiled down to a buzzword, and people on all sides, especially online, just tend to ignore nuance completely and get in these shouting matches. I mean, you have people primarily on the right side of the political spectrum who refuse to acknowledge cultural appropriation's a thing, while you have many who primarily exist on the left side who want to call every cross-cultural circumstance appropriation, when in many cases it's much more complex and could be classified in terms of appreciation, which we get into a bunch. Kae Lani also shared stories from her background growing up in a multiracial family and how that's affected her perspective on this whole conversation at large, seeing as she's someone who deals with the tension between different identity groups while simultaneously acting like a bridge between them when it comes to education on issues that matter. Really great stuff. This was one of the most informative podcasts I've ever got to do. I felt way out of my depth, so I'm sure I said a bunch of dumb stuff, but I couldn't have picked a better, more thoughtful person to do it with. And I hope you all enjoy it. Now let's get into what's really good. Kae Lani, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
It's going to be a good time. Just Twitter friends, meeting in real life.
I know.
IRL.
It was kind of creepy where I was like, I came up to the building and was like, this is a person I've talked to over the internet, so I've never met in person.
Everything our parents told us not to do growing up.
Yes, stranger danger, just no concept of it anymore.
Yes. Yeah, it's a different time. It's a different world. We can background check each other with the Googles and all that.
Yeah, it's more dangerous when a person doesn't have any like footprint on the internet.
Right. Yeah, the avatars on Twitter, the people who you're trying to become friends with, but you have no idea what their real name is, and that's always a trip. But okay, so for people who don't know, like, how did you get into what you do now with USA Today?
Yes. So for the listeners out there who don't know who I am actually a food and travel editor within USA Today network. So I primarily work with the USA Today 10 Best brand, which handles the network's Reader's Choice Awards. We write a lot about travel. We get a lot of local experts to give us what they think is the best in their local markets, in their cities or their states. And then I am also the co-founder of the network's newest adventure, which is Eat, Sip, Trip, which focuses on the cross-section of food and travel, but it gives a lot of background, like historical and cultural context to the foods that we enjoy.
And how much of it's national versus international? Like, do you travel a lot for it, or is it mostly regional?
I do get to travel, and sometimes I travel internationally, and sometimes it's only within the United States, but yeah.
Super cool. So why food? What got you into food? Let's go back a bit and tap into that part of yourself that really thought, this is what I want to do.
Yes. Well, 2010 was like the first time I traveled on my own, like out of the country. It was a study abroad semester, and I lived in Germany. I moved to a little town called Heidelberg, which was near Frankfurt. And I started a blog, and it was just where in the world is KaeLaniKennedy.blogspot.com.
That's how it always starts. It starts on a blog. It's great.
Started with a blog, and it was just a way for me to keep in touch with my friends and with my family so that they could see what I was doing and learn all of the things that I was learning. And I've always been a very curious person. And I was curious about all there was to learn about the German culture, about the German language, and about German food and beer and all of that. And so I would share it on this blog. And then when I moved home, everyone was like, why'd you stop? Why'd you stop updating this blog? And little did I know I'd actually like built up a following.
Awesome.
Yeah. And there were people that were like, why'd this blog just disappear? And I was like, oh, it was just this period piece, this chapter of my life that I spent abroad, and now I'm going to go get a conventional job.
Right.
Because I was originally going to school for anthropology. So for like 3 years of my degree, I was going to cultural anthropology classes. I at one point was dusting off bones and categorizing them between animal and human in like a lab.
That's so cool.
And then my parents were like, had this candid conversation with me, and they were like, hey, you might not make money when you graduate. And I was like, oh, you're right. Here I am chasing my heart and dream and passion. So I pivoted really quickly to marketing, which weirdly enough, like the research components, the ability to look at culture and subcultures really benefited me in the marketing realm. So, after college, I got like a traditional job in marketing, and I worked in marketing for maybe 4 or 5 years out of college, but I always kept up blogging and kept up freelance travel writing.
The passion project.
Yes, the passion project. And then eventually I was able to make this like clean swap where I was able to, become like a travel writer full time and run a publication and, run the social media marketing. But what was so advantageous for all of my skill sets was that like, oh, she has this marketing background, but she also has research methods, and she can do a lot of research, and she understands the data of the internet.
Right.
And so it was like mixing these two worlds of like, oh, she's a good writer, does research, but she also understands how the internet works.
Yes.
So that's where the two kind of came together. But food is like my favorite way to connect with other cultures, because everybody eats, and food always has this really fascinating story behind it where it's it's a history, it's tradition, it is a culture, it's a life force of a community. If it's a dish that is primarily fish, then you understand that maybe it comes from a fishing culture, or if it has, a particular crop, whether it be like huckleberries or something, then that's like an important part of that local economy. So that's why I enjoy food.
Well, it's been interesting because the past couple of decades, I'm only 27, so I don't have too much of a scope of memory besides what I can research and see online. But it seems like in my lifetime, at least, the culture around food, and in Western culture at least, has just blown up to the point recently where you see a lot of other cultures, restaurants and dishes becoming much more popular, and it's much more in the mainstream conversation. So do you think the primary reason that it's kind of gotten to the way it is today? Is that the world's getting smaller and food is something that brings people together? Like, do you feel like that element of culture is what is kind of making this whole conversation mainstream?
There's that, and I think there was a need. There was also a curiosity that drove people to go like, oh, well, what type of cuisine does this culture enjoy? And I think there was like also the rise of Food Network and then those television shows. Yeah, definitely media. So it's like you've got this human innate curiosity and then this need to look for a unique story. And because content started moving really, really quickly, especially when the internet got introduced, people were branching out further and further and trying to see, what else is that? What other stories can they come up with? And then I think definitely Instagram did something very peculiar to cuisine.
Right.
That is like...
That's the place for foodies. It's the place for people to share that. Like
plating of food and the colors of food and, you know, how, like... people wanted to, I think it was just like this hunger for content of like, what's the wildest thing that I can eat? Like Thai rolled ice cream is a very, you know, Instagrammable food. Like some of these foods are just really, really Instagrammable. So it attracts people to go to those places and grab it and then kind of take a photo.
Yeah, show it off.
Yeah, to show it off.
What you're doing, what you're checking out, what you're eating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think even in Philadelphia, like, there's several Thai ice cream places now. I've actually never had Thai rolled ice cream.
I had it for the first time at the Boardwalk this past summer. It was actually
vegan.
To the
Boardwalk?
Yeah,
and it was vegan?
It's vegan, and it was on the Boardwalk, yeah. It was fascinating. It was really good. And yeah, it's sort of like that trend that happened, I don't even know, it was maybe like a decade ago with the dotted ice cream where it feels
dots,
the dot ice cream where like it's something when you see it, it's so different and it's fun to eat. It's not just the flavor that you're getting the experience of like what is this? It's so different in the whole. It's like that. It's so similar experience when you go to like an artisan bakery or somewhere where you can see the process of what's being made, and you get to feel like it's not just oh, I came here to get this food because it's good. You know, I want to come here for the experience, like the Starbucks experience. You want to see them pouring the coffee and all that, which is I think what a lot of younger people are craving now. It's that full-on experience
that
with the
was
food.
And even within the travel industry, there was a report done in 2016 that was about how the millennials are looking for the most authentic experience. They want to go to the places that their friends went to, but they want to do the things that their friends didn't get around to. And that's why Airbnb kind of took off, was this concept of living like a local. And even because I straddled both the travel and the food world because they're really closely connected. And there is this kind of like elitist conversation that happens where it's like the traveler versus the tourist.
Right.
Yeah. And like where some people will be like, oh, well, you know, you can't get caught up in the tourist attractions or go off the beaten track, and which can sometimes be, I don't know, presumptuous. It could be like, and it's not about like, oh, who can do the most authentic thing. It's, hey, celebrate that, you know, someone who might not be able to travel as much as, say, a travel writer or travel blogger or influencer or whoever. Like, celebrate the fact that they are actually going out and experiencing something new.
Right.
They're stepping outside of their comfort zone. Maybe it's just a little bit, but they're stepping outside of it and they're seeing something new and they are embracing another culture. Like,
yeah, we have such a tendency in just the way conversations like this revolve these days to just put so much judgment on top of how we observe what people do. You know, even with something like Airbnb, as simple as that is, I do this all the time. I catch myself making the same judgments where I've used Airbnb a bunch when I've traveled, and for someone who's never used it and sort of takes the more like hotel, like kind of by the book, traditional way of traveling, I have that tendency to judge them based on their decision making in that way, but it's for no real good reason. It's just this really snotty, like it comes from that place of just, I experienced this thing, I feel like this is the right way to do it, and now I'm going to project that onto everybody else. And that's what we do. We do that with all these types of conversations, and food is so electric now because it's wrapped up in so many different conversations.
And it becomes,
you know?
it becomes very weirdly competitive, and it might be because of like social media points. Like everyone's competing for the social media points. Like who can have the most authentic experience in this place? Or...
Just the word authentic is ruined.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Like when someone says authentic to me, I almost turn off instantly because I'm thinking it has become almost a marketing term. It's not really even, it used to mean real, genuine, but these are all words that have sort of been hijacked by the greater culture, the broader culture, at large, which now people, like you mentioned before, people are looking for quote unquote authentic experiences on Instagram, but then it sort of makes it not authentic because you're doing this for attention. Like it's more of a self-fulfilling thing than it is you're really going to this place to appreciate some culture or some part of a culture, whether it's food or fashion or, some location.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting. You and I talked previously before coming into this whole thing about how we can tie in the broader conversation on cultural appropriation. And it's interesting because even just that term is so electric in the conversations today because it's wrapped up in all this other lingo, like words like privilege and colonialism. And it's hard to even know where to start to talk about it because it's not... It's more buzz. It's a buzz topic, you know. So how do you want to jump in?
Exactly. I don't want people to lose what that word truly means because it's a multi-layered definition that also deserves a conversation, and it deserves things to be looked at case by case because sometimes you can conflate an issue that's not necessarily cultural appropriation, but the way the media moves, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the way that media covers it and the way that people write these hot takes on Twitter, it then starts to, the meaning of it begins reduced. So I have prepared a statement because I did not want to step out of line because it is such a sensitive topic, and it's one that as a food and travel editor and writer myself and creator, I am constantly in a world where I am confronting cultural appropriation. I am, I have to make editorial decisions when it comes to assigning certain people, certain topics that they want to write about. So cultural appropriation is when the dominant culture takes elements from a minority culture. And so that definition is so much deeper than that. But for many people, that's where the definition stops because you have on one side, you've got some white people, not all white people, but some. And they hear that term cultural appropriation and they think that it means that people are policing them and what they can and can't enjoy because they're white. And they feel as though their freedom of speech and their freedom of expression is being infringed upon. On the other side, you've got people who interpret cultural appropriation as any time a white person touches something that's not from their culture, they are Columbusing minority culture, and they are a colonizer, and they deserve to be shamed. Those are two extremes because with anything, there is a spectrum. But neither of those definitions is fully true because it misses the biggest part of cultural appropriation, which is the imbalance of power. The true conversation of cultural appropriation is not whether or not a white person is doing something. Right. It is about confronting that imbalance of power. So historically, when white nations began colonizing other nations, they didn't just claim land and resources. They were also wiping out cultures of people that they colonized, often forcing them to assimilate with European culture. But simultaneously, Europeans exoticized and fetishized the cultures that they dominated, and they often took those flavors, styles, customs, music, and etc., so that they could continue to enjoy them. And oftentimes when they took those cultural elements, they copied those cultural elements, they used those things outside of the original context and used it in a way to position themselves as higher status, as worldly, as exotic, or they even made it look like it was something unique that they discovered. Right. And so that's the true issue. That's at the heart of the cultural appropriation situation. So determining what falls under cultural appropriation has to be a conversation. And there's a lot of context to unpack with it because there's cultural exchange, which is absolutely unavoidable when you get cultures that come together. It's unavoidable. But cultural exchange can really be like a beautiful thing too. You could create new innovations, create new types of cuisines. You can come up with new art forms. Like throughout all of history, cultural exchange can be seen to be some of the most impactful things to humanity.
Yeah.
Like different types of arches that were discovered in the Levant that were brought over by the Arabs, or, different types of architecture styles that like revolutionized the way that civilizations could bloom and blossom.
Right.
So much. And I mean, even in the world of food, there are so many historical things. Like we wouldn't have pasta if Marco Polo didn't go to China.
Right. Most people don't know that pasta originated from China, which is, And it's interesting, too, just to jump in on that. I think most people who are on the outside of this conversation, who do look at it in the sense you mentioned before, how they see people weaponizing a term like cultural appropriation, and they say, well, cultures have been sharing, from within themselves, their music, their food, their history, and all that since the beginning of time. Since since one tribe took over another tribe, and tribes came together, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people, I think, would benefit from using that term cultural exchange, which I think is much less used because it's not a buzzword, and that sort of was what takes place of what those people are referring to.
But there is like a true fine line, and it's a very fine line that does need both parties to like discuss.
Right.
It's a fine line between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation, because cultural exchange can quickly become cultural appropriation if things aren't taken into consideration. So, like, a true cultural exchange needs to have mutual understanding and respect for the minority culture, and it needs to be done in a way that is respectful and humble. And cultural exchange requires listening to any marginalized communities so that there is an understanding of the way that their cultures have been appropriated and have been exploited over time. And just that extra effort and that level of critical thinking that's involved, that can create meaningful cultural exchange and can help break centuries-old patterns of colonialism. So, but without that step of educating ourselves and giving acknowledgement to marginalized communities, that's where the imbalance of power continues to be perpetuated.
Right, and this is like where conversations on folks like Anthony Bourdain come in, where he's been, in a lot of ways, lifted up in this sense because he was someone who went in to other cultures and really learned from the ground up, what the culture was about, like what these people did with their food. It wasn't him going in to take the bits and pieces and bring it back in some higher.
And it was never a story about him.
Right.
And that's the biggest distinction between, I think, like truly good journalism and then like kind of the world of blogging, microblogging, Instagramming, is that, you can avoid the damage of cultural appropriation if you are a journalist that goes in and is, actually curious, doesn't treat that culture like it's weird or exotic. Because there's like nothing worse than like watching a YouTube video of a blogger who gets chicken feet in China and then they like play with it. And,
right.
That's so disrespectful. That's like ultimately, that's really disrespectful. But like when you have someone who's like, oh wow, they are not just sharing the story of those people, they're also sharing that humanity. So sharing that humanity versus like the silly antics that some YouTubers get into or some Instagrammers.
Yeah. And a lot of it's wrapped up in consumerism and capitalism and neocolonialism. Like this whole, I think what a lot of people don't know is that the term, I didn't know this before I started looking into it, is that the term cultural appropriations existed. It was created from academia in the 70s and the 80s, and it got popularized over decades, and there's been so much research and so many people who work within these career fields and degree fields when they're going for their bachelor's or PhD, they have to read tons of research papers on it. Like it's not something that developed out of thin air, which I think a lot of people assume. They sort of, we've been touching on, but they sort of package it together with terms like privilege, where a term like privilege is one that we can benefit as a society from having some kind of mutual understanding on where people are coming from when they use the word. But in a lot of broader pop culture, it becomes weaponized against the majority, which is generally white people. So a lot of those white people, when they hear a term like cultural appropriation, they think it's in that same box of just, a bunch of progressive nut jobs or whatever. They created this term to shut down conversations around food, which is really unfortunate. It's not a term that should be weaponized to shut down. It should be a term that opens up the conversation on where this originates.
Absolutely. Yeah. That in order for us to learn and actually create real solutions and create an understanding, we definitely need to have a conversation of, what can we learn from these situations? Because nobody's going to do it perfectly the first time. There are so many examples. I think it feels like 2015, mid 2015 to 2016 is when cultural appropriation, especially with food, became a really prominent hot topic. And one of those pivotal moments was the Bon Appetit PSA, how to eat pho. Did you ever see that?
I'm trying to remember.
It was in Philly.
I forget if I remember seeing it, but refresh my memory. I have the worst memory.
Sure. So, Bon Appetit released a video with an article that went along with it on their website where they interviewed the guy who owns Stock. Forgive me, I forget the chef's name, but Stock is a pho place that's on Girard in Fishtown, which is a really gentrified neighborhood in Philadelphia. And so they came and they interviewed him, and he talked about how to eat pho and took it all the way down to what you should and shouldn't do. Don't, reach for the hoisin or the sriracha right away, taste the broth first. And then he was trying to tell people, give your chopsticks a little twirl. And preface this with it was a white chef. It's a white guy who makes pho in Fishtown, and it's overpriced and yeah, but I think the video itself, so the article was PSA, how to eat ramen, but then I think the title of the article or maybe the title of the video was pho is the new ramen.
Yes, I do remember this. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That was there were a lot of issues with that. It was just so blatantly bad. I have opinions about Stock because I have opinions about Stock as a restaurant because I've tried it 3 times. It's not that good, to be quite honest. I have better pho when you go to the actual Vietnamese places on Washington Ave.
Right.
Or,
we have one literally 5 minutes from here. It's called Vietnam Cafe. It's 3 or 4 generations of a Vietnamese family, and it is amazing.
Yes.
It's just the best.
And you're getting that experience of this Stock is a fancy restaurant, and it's one of those ones that doesn't have a phone, so you can't make reservations. You have to show up.
Right. That exclusive whole.
Yeah, it has that exclusive flair, and then it's just needlessly expensive. And he got a lot of flack from that, and a lot of that flack was definitely deserved. But it was interesting to watch as his Yelp reviews started to decline. So people nationwide who had never been to Stock just started railing, using Yelp as a way to try to take him down and take down his restaurant. And, whether I don't know if he has learned, honestly, I haven't kept up on that specific story, but I do know that Stock is still open. It wasn't shut down, but they did have this awful media shitstorm, lack of a better word, over the fact that Bon Appetit just massively, and there's the conversation too of is it the chef or is it how the media
That's
is
exactly
representing
what I was
the
ask you,
chef?
because it wasn't them that picked out that restaurant because of the popularity, and he was someone who moved into this area that's being gentrified, and it has a story that I think resonates in popular culture, whereas it's not as appealing for some reason to mass audiences when you just go to that hole in the wall place, from the Vietnamese family or the Korean family or whatever it is.
But that's media's responsibility, because make that story good. And Jonathan Gold, rest in peace. And also Anthony Bourdain. We lost 2 extremely powerful, voices in the food community. And those were two people who could go to those hole-in-the-wall places and make it a magical story, because guess what? It wasn't about them, the eater. It was about the people. It was such people-driven stories that helped you connect so on like an emotional level, on a level of humanity with the immigrant chefs that have those hole-in-the-wall restaurants that needed that elevation. That, there's stories of like restaurants in LA that were suffering, and then Jonathan Gold came in, wrote up a review, and then boom, business was booming, which is amazing, which is great. And, I argue to say Guy Fieri does the same thing. Yeah. Like people make fun of Guy Fieri, but
he's so memeable. He's just a giant meme.
I love that he can be a meme, but you got to look at what he's doing. He's going to these small communities. He's like uplifting amazing food from all over the country, giving them free press. He donates to all of these organizations that are near and dear to his heart. And then he like also promotes those organizations on his show. It's so good.
Right. And in contrast to him, I just read this in the news a couple of days ago, this whole thing with Gordon Ramsay's new show.
Oh,
so in contrast to that type of attitude where I forget what the show's called, but it's coming
Gordon
out.
Ramsay Uncharted.
That's what it's called?
Yes.
So he's apparently, I guess the premise, correct me if I'm wrong, but the premise is he's going into other cultures and he's basically batting up against like specific dishes that they create, and then he's going to try to compete with his interpretation of that dish.
Yeah.
So what is your take on that in contrast to the figures you just named?
I'm so surprised that this is not getting as much anger as some other things that I've seen in the media, because there are some other like media outrage stories where I look at that and I'm like, really? Like, I'll give you an example after this, but like this story, and it's on National Geographic of all places, some of the most reputable when it comes to anything like travel and culture related. You would think that National Geographic would have the foresight of like, and I read the press release. So yeah, that is the premise of the show. The premise of the show is that he's not just going to like communities, he's going to the country.
Right.
He's like, it's a travel food show. So he's traveling to other countries and he is pitting himself against families and people or chefs in those regions that like make a certain local cuisine, and then he thinks that he can do it better. Like, that's what the press release said. It was like, oh, and he's going to see if he could do it better.
Because he's an egomaniac. That's sort of he has that sort of Simon Cowell sort of ego draw to him, where people love his anger and his explosions and his intensity.
I hope he doesn't get like super angry.
It's going to make it worse.
So in the press release, it had said he's discovering the undiscovered, which again is one of the core issues of cultural appropriation, where it's like you cannot discover something that has already been there.
Right.
And they said it right there in the press release.
Right. Yeah. It's so. See, when I see examples like that, it just seems so glaring to me. But it is so interesting how I kind of go back and forth on it, because there's also like one of the big ones you're going back to, say, like mid 2015 with that whole issue with the pho restaurant. In that time, there was also like during the election cycle and when Trump was being elected, he was making tons of racist comments about Mexicans and all that. And then he came out with that tweet on Cinco de Mayo where he had
the taco salad.
Right, the taco salad. But that was what was interesting about it was, okay, here's someone who has made more than his fair share of derogatory and awful comments toward this race of people, but he's saying, I enjoy this food still. So it's this interesting dynamic where he posted this picture and people jump on the outrage, because that's what we do when Trump posts anything. We jump on the outrage. But it opens up this conversation about food, which is really, it's been continuing down this path where you have these incidents like that, or like this one with the restaurant. And part of me, it's almost this weird backlash effect where obviously the action of that in and of itself is not a good thing, but the sort of reaction to it has been really interesting. It's been interesting to see people having these conversations and sort of furthering along this mutual understanding of what cultural appropriation is. Where do we draw the lines? Because then on the other end of the spectrum, you have instances, I can't think of any off the top of my head on food, but there's certain fashion ones that are very, like, there's ones that are obvious. You have people who are dressing up like Pocahontas, and then it's like, okay, it's a style statement. That's clearly racist, and you're demeaning that culture into some consumerist fashion trend. So you have ones like that are obvious, but then you have other ones that are a little bit more gray, where it's like, it could be something like the hoop earrings or someone's eyebrow styles, or there's a lot of really nuanced variables involved where you have members of the culture who is claiming to be appropriated in this sense, and they're bringing up, hey, this is where this was taken from. But then you have other people in contrast saying, well, then it was taken from this other culture 100 years prior. And it's interesting how a lot of the terminology involved here, it's around the word colonialism, because that I think is really important to help define the differentiate between cultural appropriation and then culture exchange, which you had brought up before.
Yeah, it's understanding that context. Like and like with clothing, that's very like specific, because there are things that fashion does, like dreads or box braids or cornrows or things like that, where, in high fashion, it's seen as vogue and it's seen as cosmopolitan. But then you have these situations where Black individuals can't have dreads in school, or they will get fired from their jobs. So that is an imbalance of power, and that does there needs to be a conversation, and there needs to be a recognition of that imbalance. Yeah,
it's all about the power dynamic. And I think food's the sort of interesting one within this conversation, because food is so shared. Kind of like what we were hinting at before, where like a lot of people don't know. People associate noodles with Italy, whereas they don't really think of China. So it's interesting how a lot of neighboring cultures, and you have a lot of neighboring Asian cultures specifically, like they share a lot. Well, there is a lot of colonialism also in Asia, but there's also a lot of sharing of different dishes and preparations and all that. So is there something about food that can you separate like the sort of cultural appropriation conversation on food from the broader ones on fashion, religion, etc.? How is it different, I guess, or is it more the same?
It's a little same, but it can be very different, because food is so exchanged. And like you said, it does have this history that you can trace it back like hundreds and hundreds, and sometimes even 1,000 years, to situations where, it really does become quite blurred. One of my favorite things to look at is like the spice route. So I traveled to Israel last year and went to a lot of Nabatean ruins. And the Nabateans were the people that were responsible for transporting a lot of spices from the East, and then taking it through the Middle East, and then to the Mediterranean, and then off to Europe.
Wow.
So in Israeli cuisine, and I say Israeli cuisine really loosely, because they recognize that the foods that they enjoy, are influenced by hundreds of cultures over thousands of years that have called the Levant their home. And it's, there's a Moroccan influence, there's an African influence, there's this like the spices that were, coming through the spice trade over 2,000 years ago. But it's fun to follow those spices and how they influence food as they go along. So you have great things like shakshuka, and we enjoy shakshuka for brunch, but the history of shakshuka is that it was popular from Spain and through the Ottoman Empire, and there were all these different versions. The version that we enjoy today is definitely from the Levant, which is Israel today, and that's with the egg, and it's mostly the tomato based. But the fact that when it's served on a iron skillet, that is an influence from Morocco. So if you think about food. So have you ever had tempura in Japan?
Not in Japan.
Or rather tempura here?
Yeah, I've had tempura.
Okay, so we think of that as a Japanese food?
Get me, I don't know.
It's from Portugal.
Oh, wow.
It was brought from Portugal by missionaries in the 1500s to Japan, and it was even the term tempura. I forget what the specific word was, but it was what was eaten during Lent. It was so when missionaries I guess not fasted, but omitted certain foods from their diets. Excuse me, I am not Catholic. So my knowledge is not as deep as someone who is Catholic. They would substitute a lot of foods for these deep fried peas or these pea shoots or whatever. But they were also really good for long distance travel. So these Portuguese missionaries had tempura with them, and that influenced tempura in Japan. And now we see that as like a specifically Japanese thing.
Japanese dish, yeah. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
It's okay. So when you look at when you look at the broader conversation then around the sort of exchanging of cultural items around food, and then how we look at that versus appropriating, like what are some of the solutions that everyday people can make to understanding this better, and what are some more solutions on the broader scale of media that you think we could be doing better in how we cover the topic?
Sure. Let me think. As individuals, because it is a lot to ask someone to go like, okay, now read the entire history of this food. But just recognize that it does have an origin elsewhere. Even just that simple act of acknowledging that it belongs to another culture. Acknowledge, give credit to those cultures as well. Try to, as often as possible, maybe eat at a restaurant where the chef, is from that culture. You'll probably have a better dining, more authentic. If you're looking for authentic, you'll have a more authentic dining experience. And just also read into things. Because like one thing I wanted to bring up was like something called the collard greens kerfuffle.
Sounds awesome. Hit me.
So I think this was January 14th, 2016, because I have a screenshot of the tweet. Whole Foods tweeted out a picture of collard greens with peanuts in it. And peanuts and cranberries, and looks delightful. And so the tweet says, if you're not cooking with these greens, you need to be. How to cook collards. And it's a link, and then it says hashtag health, yeah. And so as soon as that got tweeted out, the poor social media manager behind that tweet probably was like, oh, healthy, vegetable, it's great for,
not thinking deeply into,
thinking deeply, although you don't really have to think that deeply. So basically, Black Twitter, hashtag Black Twitter, got super offended by the fact that, number one, it was like, what's this bougie like grocery store tweeting about collards for? And number two, like, who the hell puts peanuts in it? What crazy white people stuff is this?
Right.
And so Black Twitter started all these jokes, and like it was kind of funny. Background on myself, I'm a mixed person. I have white family, I have Black family, and I also am part Nunachuk Lenape, which is the tribe from this region.
Oh, wow.
And so not to get into all of that, like I grew up also eating collard greens. I also grew up going to powwows, and I also grew up eating like mid-century white people food and pasta and things like that. But my experience with collard green was absolutely with peanuts. So when I saw my Black community saying like, what type of white nonsense is this? And like getting all in a tizzy about like, who dares puts peanuts in collards? I was like, are we not supposed to? I feel like
what am I doing wrong?
I must have been eating collard greens incorrectly for my entire life. And so a lot of articles came out about it. The Huffington Post was like, oh, Black Twitter is not happy about this collard greens issue. There was this publication, The Root. Have you ever read anything on The Root?
Yeah.
So the Root wrote this article that was like, nowhere in the African diaspora has peanuts ever touched collard greens. So all these articles came out. So some journalists came forward and were like, what are you talking about? They gave the history of this, of collard greens, and you had this community of Black Twitter that thought they were culturally appropriating collard greens. Collard greens was getting gentrified. It's getting Columbused. It's getting colonized. But then you had these researchers, including Michael Twitty, who is this fantastic chef. He came out with a book that actually won a James Beard Awards this past year called The Cooking Gene. And it was the slave influence on American cuisine. And it's a fantastic book. And he's got this awesome blog that's called, hold on, I have it up. It's like Afro Culinaria. And that's a really fantastic blog. He even stepped into this conversation and was like, hold up, everyone. Before you get all outraged, you got to look at the history of collard greens. And so collard greens ended up having this like really long history, and including not just with the South, but it was like collard greens historically wasn't just a Black food or a Black person food. It was a food that helped both whites and Blacks in the South from starvation in certain points. I think at one point in Gone with the Wind, Scarlett is like dreaming of, fields of collard greens. Cause I guess I don't know too much about, Gone with the Wind, but I guess that it was pre-war times. But anyway, she even references her love of collard greens. I'm going to try and find the quote.
Yeah, find it. I had no idea there was this much here. This is so interesting.
Okay. So, in Gone with the Wind, a hungry Scarlett laments her ruined plantation and daydreams of pre-war meals, including collards swimming richly in a pot liquor iridescent with grease. So there's this long history in America of collard greens, but if you trace collard greens even farther back, it's very common. In Western Africa, it's very commonly served with a peanut, peanut paste. So even Black Twitter got collard greens wrong.
Wow. Was this something that had to be uncovered, or how, was
People
it just lost history?
It is kind of a lost history. It's not like a lost history because there's actually a lot of books about it. There's actually a book called Collards that talks about the history of collard greens. Right there, but it took these food anthropologists, and there is actually a part of anthropology that's called foodways, which studies the pathways of where food comes from and what cultures influence it. And what the histories are behind that. And even Twitty was like, no, you got to understand.
That's so helpful.
Yeah. But whether or not those publications that came out with that outrage story, whether or not they actually went back and corrected it is unclear, because you can easily Google, and when you Google that situation, I think CNN is the first thing that comes up. And even CNN, that's what killed me. CNN, they quoted Michael Twitty's blog post where he talks about the full history of collard greens, but they pulled out the weakest quote and left all the other context out.
No context, yeah.
No context. So it's I don't know if it's to drive clicks or to drive shares or to drive outrage, but kind of in this digital media marketplace, outrage gets clicks.
Yeah. Well, that's what's so difficult for most people, I think, to navigate the situation around food and appropriation is that so much of identity is wrapped into it. And with identity, it's not, I think often people think that we exist in a vacuum, that our views exist just in the ether, and that me as an individual, the views I have on food and culture is almost, we almost all think that we're objective in some capacity when we each refuse, often in context, to understand, the broader histories of oppression and colonialism and how and just travel and geography and how all these factors together, you're talking about the spice route, how there's all these different means, whether it's been through decades or centuries or thousands of years, that food has traveled, and it's not just as simple as saying, bread came from here and now it is over here. It's you get war, you get slavery, slavery, you get oppressions of all sorts of different kinds. It's not always this just mutual exchange. So when you get talking about an issue like this with the collard greens, I think it's an important factor to bring up identity, but I think people get lost in the conversation on identity. Like, I think it's really important to be able to understand the history of Black America in this situation particularly, and like you mentioned, your mixed identity. I think that's a really important thing to bring up here. I think often, just like the other things we've been talking about, just like the term cultural appropriation, people tend to weaponize their identity in a way to say, okay, well, if you're this skin color, you can't talk about it. And if you are this skin color, you can talk about it. But what you just labeled is a perfect example of how the people of the skin color who should have been representing this food got it wrong. Yeah. So it's interesting how we have to get to a place where I think, and this is something I talk about a lot on this podcast, is the conversation on identity politics is people talking past each other left to right constantly, where you have people on the right who primarily focus on the individual, and they say, we need to move past race, we need to move past gender, we need to move past all these groups and classes and just be people, just be individuals. And then you people further left who say, you can't do that because, like, wrapped into each one of these groups, you have complications of oppression, you have class warfare, you have different genders being treated differently, and there's so many complicated variables that don't offer us all to have the same footing, the same starting point. Like, there's a lot more nuance to it. So in between those two, you have people on the fringes of both sides, like, shouting down and using extremities and weaponized terminology. But then you also have people toward the center who I think are getting a more mutual understanding of where the other is coming from here, and that is what allows, I think, the bridge between the gap here, because that's like, that story is a perfect example that you just gave of people coming at an issue and there's outrage, which, like, sort of what I was trying to get at before with the Trump thing. It's like, it's not something that I would look at and say this is a good thing, but when something happens and then there's a reaction that causes bigger conversations, there's a benefit in some way to that, where something crazy happens and then people rally around that cause and there's attention to it. And I think that's the kind of thing that I think more people would benefit from after the outrage. It's like, okay, we have outrage over this thing that Katy Perry wore, or this style that Rihanna has, or this food that Gordon Ramsay is now trying to compete against. Like, we have all these instances of outrage, and I think calling them out for what they are in the age of new media, like, it's important on some level. It's also overblown on other levels. But either way, I think how we react in the aftermath to that in these ways where we can now dissect what's right and what's wrong, what's missing, like the context.
What's constructive to that conversation? There was The Atlantic is the one who, like, really dove deep into the collard greens kerfuffle, as he called it.
Right.
And there was an awesome quote where he said, "It's a tiny, trivial controversy, but the small amount of damage it did to the quality of public discussion accumulates over similar instances where journalists are similarly overzealous in portraying the interracial conflict and may
weird word.
It's just like may cumulatively, I don't know, like, that's a weird word, amount to real harm." So, like, what he's saying is, like, portraying this as, like, a bad, like, as a true conflict is doing more harm to the conversation than good. That, like, that was truly a misunderstanding. Like, if they had tweeted, like, how to cook collard greens like Black people, like, that would be so outrageous.
So glaringly,
that would be so bad. But this was just, like, literally a vegetable.
Yeah.
A vegetable that has, like, a more complex history than what people were. Yeah.
And that is the biggest thing, because with headlines now, there is that, it's just a constant, we conflate different issues of different scale all as one thing. And that's what drives a narrative. And I think it's so difficult in these conversations to bridge any kind of gap, because, again, it's really a shame how certain terminology gets weaponized to shut people down in this way when it can be used to educate them. Like, do you ever think about this? Like,
we're missing an opportunity to be able to take, the chefs that open up restaurants. We're missing an opportunity to sit down with them and say, like, hey, this is an opportunity for you to do right by the community that you're borrowing from. If you're going to open up a restaurant, why don't you, hire cooks and chefs and elevate chefs from that culture? Why don't you, set up a fund to help get the kids in that community the education that they need? Why don't you, service that community that you're borrowing from? Because instead you're just kind of like, taking someone else's food and then lining your pockets with profits.
And I think that's where a lot of the people who are on the more left side of the spectrum of this issue fall, where they get so, I think at this point in our nation's history, like this, we're in 2018, and like outrage is at its all-time high, polarization's at its all-time high. And I think people on that more left side of the spectrum are just fed up at this point with power dynamics that are in place, and like they don't have, and this is a huge issue, I think, and like they've lost a lot of the people, at least the people on the far end of the spectrum who drive a lot of these narratives, they've lost their patience entirely with dealing with situations like that, where there's instances with people who, like, say, like this white guy who opens up this restaurant in a gentrified area, which is problematic. And I think there's a tendency to see that as it's just happening everywhere, and it's such a big issue, and it's not going away. And I think people are so tired of yelling about it, and they shut down. They don't want to educate. Like they don't want to reach across the aisle because they're seeing this issue that to them is glaringly obvious, and it honestly should be glaringly obvious. But the biggest issue that I always look at is, what are the solutions? Like, how do you improve the dialogue? How do you improve
because it's
the
not
education?
it's not gonna stop. Like I said before, it's inevitable to have some type of cultural exchange when so many different diverse communities are in such close quarters with one another. And it is a tough conversation to have, and I completely empathize with how protective certain cultures are of their cuisine, especially when it's, kids who grew up eating this food that their mom would pack them like Filipino food for lunch, and then they would get to school, and then like other kids would make fun of them because your food is stinky, your food is sticky, your food is XYZ.
That's so damaging when you're a kid.
Yeah, and now here it is. It's like I'm 29, so like 20 plus years later, you've got these new cuisines that are the new it girl, as my friend Joey Hernandez of the Chicago Tribune kind of put it. He was like, he grew up, he wrote this amazing article about how the foods that he grew up with were stinky and people made fun of them. But now it's this bittersweet realization that the foods that he was made fun of for are now the new it girl. Yeah. And what is that bittersweetness of like, yay, people are engaging with my culture, but it's a lot of cognitive dissonance for sure.
Yeah, it's the whole thing with like Asian pop fusion, where it's just, that's all that is. I mean, when I was younger, that was so regularly just made fun of and dismissed through elementary school and like 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade, 10th grade. It was like a sort of stereotype that felt very normal amidst peers, where it was just like, oh yeah, like that, like that's so, it was so out of the just the day-to-day understanding of like suburban white kids, which was like where I grew up. We had different Asian and Black and Native American. We had a bunch of different ethnicities in the area, but it was a vastly majority white community. So when it came to a lot of the cuisine conversations, like that, you made fun of them. Like it was just an ostracization of this person's culture. When you're that young and you're in the majority, you have no concept for what that does to someone's psyche. Like when I grew up, I'm in the majority of my community, so like my understanding as a child who does not have his cognitive functioning brain developed, like I don't understand what it's like for a kid who's in a like white dominant school who's getting made fun of for eating a certain kind of, like one of my best friends, his name was Chris, in 4th and 5th grade, and he was Filipino. I haven't seen or talked to this kid since 5th grade, but his mom, I remember, was really good friends with my mom, and he was just wonderful, and she was the sweetest woman ever, and every time we went over to her house, she was always making us these delicious egg rolls and like trying to share a recipe, and they were so open and like wanting to share more of their culture, but it was such a he like that was not a popular thing like within our school, you know what I mean? So like my lens, like how I viewed where he was coming from and his perspective was so like we never had a conversation about it. Like I knew the kid for 2-3 years. We were really good friends. Like it never got brought up because it was just like we were so young, and like I have no idea what it was like for him to be growing up in this community that was so just completely like not in any way open to where his family came from and the type of food that he ate day to day, you know? So it's interesting. Yeah,
kids aren't taught, or like kids aren't born knowing the differentiating features of like everybody. They just see like people, and then they see food, and like everything to them is new because they're discovering and learning about the world around them. But they are definitely taught hate and anger, and it makes me curious to what's going on now of like, what are the messages that kids are getting? Because like, you know, I grew up in a mixed household, but the side of the family that I'm more close to is my mom's side of the family. Mm-hmm. So it's, you know, she's Black, Native, and also a little bit of French. And, it's a lot of influence there, but I am this white passing chick. Although I did get in a lift the other day and the guy was like, "Oh, you are racially ambiguous." And I get this a lot. I am asked a lot, "What are you?" And it's this odd conversation where I have to like list all of these things. But, you know, I don't say those things as like, "Oh yeah, I am this like blood quantum or whatever." No, I say this as like I am an active participant in multiple cultures because I grew up in a multicultural household. But like my grandfather, he was born in 1938 and he grew up in Jim Crow South where he had a curfew and had to go home at a certain time. He wasn't, as a kid, allowed to eat in white establishments, but he does like have this fond memory of like, you know, I think like I tweeted out a couple of weeks ago about how we took him to a P.F. Chang's and he was like, "Oh man, when I was a kid, we would never be able to eat in like a nice establishment like this." He's like, "We couldn't even eat at the hot dog stand," but he never forgets to this day. And then this must be at least 70 years ago. He remembers a chef who would give him free hot dogs in the back alley of the hot dog stand. And he remembers that kindness. But, you know, he did live in North Carolina during a time where like he actually watched a friend get hung by the Klan. And like, so I grew up with like hearing those stories, and that has impacted my lens. So, you know, but at the same time, I am this like white passing person. So I've been able to like straddle these two positions, which has given me like a really unique perspective. Yeah. So it's like, you know, on one hand, like I'm hearing like a white conversation, but on the other hand, I'm hearing like a Black and also like minority situation where like, on top of like having colored greens in the home, there was also like going to tribal meetings in New Jersey because, and I don't think people so specifically with the Native American experience in America, like I don't think people understand just how vast and diverse and complex situation is. That like I come from a community that is recognized not federally, but only by the state of New Jersey. So there are actually like 600 tribes that are acknowledged by the federal government. There's another 600 that are not.
Wow, so I never knew that. That's insane.
You've got a lot of Native American people who grew up culturally Native American, like eating Native American foods, which I'm going to blow your mind in like a second when I tell you what those foods are. Because like you want to talk about cultural appropriation, like the idea of some Native American foods have just like completely disappeared, completely wiped out. But yeah, you know, I am in this weird situation where it's like, oh yeah, I grew up culturally with like these values that like imparted to me by a Black grandfather and by like my Lenape grandmother. And, you know, this, like I said, mixed experience, but That's a lot. That's really hard for people to swallow in America when like you are like, yeah, I've got all these backgrounds. But it's bizarre too, because it's like, well, I don't have a reservation because there is no reservation for a tribe that's not federally recognized. There is a plot of land in South Jersey in Chemung that like is shared with Powhatan, but you can't live there. So like a lot of tribal meetings will happen there. Some tribal meetings actually happen in Fairmount too. But I grew up with that experience and going to those places, luckily, to have that experience. But yeah, when it comes to Native American foods, are you ready for this?
Hit me.
When you go to the movie theater, what's like a snack that you like to eat?
I don't snack that often. I mean, popcorn is the obvious one, so.
Popcorn's a Native American food.
Wow.
Yeah. And so is cranberry sauce. And the concept of eating corn, period, is mostly New World. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What the hell?
Yeah. So there's this concept of three sisters, which is squash, corn, and beans. And like a lot of dishes will be made with them, like maybe sometimes like a succotash or like a, you just kind of eat them all together as like a weird casserole. But that concept is those three plants were in a lot of northeastern tribes, like planted all together because what one took from the soil, the other would give. So it was like this really symbiotic relationship, so that when you eat those foods or you talk about three sisters, like you're talking about those plants and the idea of this like symbiotic living of like, if you're going to take something from that ground, then you're going to give something back to to that diverse community. So if there's if there's anything to be learned from cultural appropriation, if you're going to borrow something from that soil, you better give it back.
That's so good. So just really quick, I'm interested to hear more about this.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Why would the government, I'm not educated at all on this topic, so I'm really interested. So like, why would the government not recognize like those other 600 plus tribes in this specific instance?
There's a conversation amongst tribes that are like, yeah, there is this idea, like blood quantum is heavily policed, heavily policed. There's actually situations where, like basically the concept of reservations and the concept of blood quantum was the government kind of saying like, yeah, after a certain while, they'll just crossbreed and like the blood will begin to diffuse and like cultures will just like...
They'll just go away.
They'll die out eventually, and what do you have with culture, like customs, language, foods? And when those things start to blur away, like for instance, Native American tribes weren't allowed to teach in their schools the native language until 1990. And so you've got generations of people where a language was just like completely lost and forgotten. And then you have the issues of like the Native American boarding schools where they were just beaten and put in terrible conditions and made them cut their hair, which is like a really sensitive issue with a lot of tribes.
Right.
But so reservations were kind of set up and blood quantum was kind of set up to make sure that people just like, it got diluted after a certain amount of time. And you have a lot of, Native Americans where, yeah, they did. They married outside of race. They married into other communities. With the Nanochuk Lenape in particular, they didn't want to leave the Delaware Valley area. They didn't want to leave Pennsylvania, New Jersey area. So they stayed and a lot of them assimilated. So there's this concept in the region that's called like, we are still here, where it's like, you've got average people. They work in they work at your companies. They drive cars. They live in a city. They look average folk, but they are part of this culture. And there is like a deeper community in South Jersey where they do have a governing body. I do not participate in the governing body, but like I was raised in that experience. But when you look at me, you just see like, curly haired, racially ambiguous chick.
Yeah. Well, I honestly, I didn't know. Like, just, we met online. So through on Twitter, I was like,
And so, like, publicly, like, it's so hard to, like, come forward and, like, talk about these experiences and express my own personal opinion because I am very highly aware of what I look like because I have been misunderstood completely online.
So have you, like, put out perspectives on a given issue, say, like, from the Black community or the Native American community and gotten, like, called out as being some like white girl or something.
Oh my God. Oh, I think the worst.
Because that's so common on Twitter, you know?
I think the worst one, and this like hurt me deeply, was on Facebook. And my friend messaged me and he was like, oh, there's like this group for POC, people of color. So I'm part of other POC groups. I'm part of like POC traveling groups. I'm part of like a Black traveling community as well, to make sure that those voices also get elevated and those stories are told. Yeah, so he messaged me and he was like, oh, there's this Black travel photographer and he's like looking for people in the community. And he's like, oh yeah, just join this group. I'm not going to name the group or anything. So I go to the group and it doesn't say anything about race. It was like, oh, a safe space for no matter how you define yourself sexually or racially and blah, blah, blah. It didn't really say anything about like, this is a group for Black people. And like, or, you know, so I didn't know what I was getting into. So like I applied and then like I didn't get in, but like, I don't know. So there was like another group that was like a larger, like it was a group. And then there's offshoots of that group. So this was like the group, and then like this was a subset of the group. So I was like, oh, hey, who moderates like this group? I heard that there was like a Black travel writer. I'd love to like connect with him and everything. And so the moderator of that group like hopped on and just like railed me and was like, you're white privilege wanting to get into this group, your light skin privilege. And then he like talked about, so it was one of those groups where you had to like answer a couple of questions, and one of the questions were like, what are you racially? So I went through Black, white, and also part of the Nanachoke Lenape tribe in South Jersey. Yeah. And, you know, this guy like railed on me and he was like, so what are you? Like, you said you're Black in your application, but your rhetoric says you're part of this Native American community and you can't just like, you know, he wasn't, he clearly didn't understand that there's like actually a tribe in New Jersey and a community that's actually here in the area. And I was like, whoa, I'm just trying to like, you know, get in touch with this photographer, and then he was calling me Rachel Dalzell.
That woman who tried to,
which was dumb because it was like, no, she was just white. Like,
she was pretending, she was hoping, she was saying she was, what'd she say? Like, that's how she saw herself. She saw herself as Black or something.
I don't look too much into it because honestly, like, it bothers me.
Yeah,
It's like,
I can imagine.
That's sticky. Yeah. So he was just like, oh, well, I looked through your Facebook page and nothing about your Facebook said that you were part of a disenfranchised community and there was no signs of suffering. And I thought like, whoa.
Wow.
So in his mind, he interpreted the Native American experience as being disenfranchised, which totally is. So there is a lot of it that is. But like, you know, you still got to keep moving on and you still have to keep a life going for yourself. You can't just suffer forever.
Well, that's where it gets really sticky with these groups because, you have, I see this all the time with, especially conversations around veganism too. There's like Black veganism and there's people who say the diet is a white privileged diet, and then you have like the kind of back and forth within the subculture. So you have the culture and the subculture within the race and the identity of the race, and as it splits into mixed race and in like you're a mixed three-way, and that
multiculture, it's a multiculture,
right, and like the more it splits, you get these layers of people saying, well, you have the privilege of coming off looking white.
And I'd never heard it before until that moment.
So that was the first time you've seen this?
The first time I had ever heard of this white passing privilege, and which was new to me. And I was like, oh yeah, you know what? That's totally a thing. Like, there's times where I've watched my mom get called like terrible things in front of me, and she's darker than myself. And then it's just like, but that's my mom. That's my person. Right. That's, you know, there's so many times where I've had to like come in and be like, claim her because it's like, no, she's mine. Yeah. You know, long story short, I guess like I never got in touch with that Black photographer. So it was like someone within his own community that just kind of like stepped in, policed identity, put himself as like this authority on what he thought I was and wasn't, and didn't even know me, but looked through my Facebook photos to make a judgment about my life. Because nothing on my Facebook is going to, indicate, growing up going to powwows, or like nothing on my Facebook is going to indicate that like my grandfather like watched a friend get hung by the Klan. Like none of that is going to be on my Facebook.
So how do you see? And sorry, we can get off this. Anytime you're interested, we can hop off this. But I'm very interested in it because this is something that comes up all the time in these broader conversations. And how, when you look at the way like a group like that manages itself, where it seems that it's not just the racial identity that it's basing its group identity off of, but it's also the oppression identity, where like those two things sort of go hand in hand with like a lot of the rhetoric within person of color groups, where like it's not just a matter of this is our racial identity, that's wrapped up in oppression of some kind. So then how that relates then to other groups where there's say a black person who grows up in white suburbia in like an upper middle class area, like so if that kid, say there's a kid in this family and growing up and grows up in, for what it's worth, a quote unquote class privileged life, like would that kid not be able to identify in the same way as a lot of these groups? So you get these kind of dynamics of oppression and power. So like when you look at the larger conversation happening around this, like how do you see it overall as something that's beneficial, and how do you see it how do you see it, like what do you think the end goal is, and like in how we have these conversations around race in this sense?
Yeah, that is a multi-layered, like everyone's experience is going to be so unique and so different, and to be able to I can't make any judgments or blanket statements except to say, like, from my own experience, it's like I did fall into, like, especially after the election, I did fall into that mindset of like, oh, the world is like taking opportunities away from me. And I fell into a lot of like, I saw myself getting angry. And in addition to getting angry, I was also becoming well aware of what I was and how I was different. And that thought made me think twice about even topics that I was right. It started to like impact my job, where I felt as though, oh, if I'm not, German, I can't write about German food. Or if I'm not Mexican, then I can't write about Mexican food. Like, and then at some points, like, I didn't even feel like I could talk about the Native American experience, because then like that makes people really confused, because they're just like, well, you didn't grow up on a reservation and you're part of a tribe that's not nationally or federally recognized, and like, you've got this privilege here, and like you grew up in like a mostly
it becomes like
white
a percentage game. It's like, okay,
and then it's like I'm such like an odd, bizarre jigsaw puzzle piece. Like, I don't even know where I personally fit in to the whole grand scheme of things. I miss when I was able to, like, I felt like there was a point in time where I was able to float between groups, which is also a privilege, where it was like I was able to experience and participate in all of the parts of me, and I didn't feel like I wasn't any of those things. But nowadays, like, I am hyper aware that, like, I am different.
Yeah.
I'm hyper aware that I am extremely different, and, can't be in certain groups anymore, or can't have certain conversations anymore. I don't know if that's beneficial. I don't know.
Yeah, because this seems to just tie back around to what I was saying earlier in the conversation. This is the more right end of the spectrum's argument of identity politics, where the more you hyper-focus on a specific group around race, gender, any type of like individual or group identity, in a sense, you get these issues of sort of, it becomes this percentage game of exclusion, where like you have then the person coming from the Native American tribe who grew up on a reservation, they get to look at someone in your shoes and say, well, you didn't grow up on a reservation. Or you can look, like from the same perspective, name a different race, where you could say, well, you're only this percentage of this race, so now you can't be part of this group. And it becomes this sort of in-out thing. And it's interesting because on the one hand, from an identity standpoint and how you educate the outside world. In America, Western culture, which is a primarily white culture, it's cool to be able to highlight these identities, and then it educates the broader culture in a way on why it's important to not just whitewash history, and it's important to understand the differences between these different tribal identities. And that's something that I think you were talking about. There was a period in your life where you could just kind of like go between groups.
Yeah, it felt very fluid, and there was I didn't feel like I didn't belong anywhere.
Yeah, but I think that also that period, which like people in our age bracket are familiar with, it was a sort of period where broadly the rhetoric in our culture was don't see race. Like the sort of rhetoric was like we are in a lulled period where things culturally weren't like we were like I think a lot of it has to do with 9/11. Honestly, it's like we kind of had this foreign threat, and then people were banding together in America, and a lot of the divisions that had existed previously, and like to say like the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, like through civil rights and the crack epidemic, and there's all these different big cultural dividing issues that were highlighting race and class. And I feel we were in this. You and I kind of grew up in this lulling period where it felt very much so. There wasn't that much highlighting in the media on race, unless it was Middle Eastern descent, or So it's interesting how that in a lot of ways was good, because it brought a lot of younger people up in this way where we can see people as individuals. But then now, like you've been saying, the past several years since the rise of Black Lives Matter and the rise of like this new wave of feminism and intersectionality and the 2016 election, there's all these sort of landmark movements and events that have really shaped this new on social media, this new conversation on race and identity and gender and all these defining groups. And I'm with you. I don't really know. I'm in the middle. Like I see the benefit of getting to understand where these groups are coming from, which I was never in a position to do before. Like I was never in a position to really think about it. Like it was never highlighted to me. It was something that I was in this white culture, like just privileged away from understanding like the deep complexities within those identities. So in a lot of ways I can benefit from understanding the cultural context going back decades and centuries. But at the same time, it comes with this exclusionary practice between groups where it seems like it's endless. Like the further left you go too, it just gets more and more complicated because it just keeps branching into deeper and deeper identity groups.
And then it and even in my position of like as a travel writer and as a food writer as well, I didn't feel like I was allowed to speak on any issue or like explore anything because I felt as though it had become so divided. It has become so divided that I just like felt like I didn't belong in that conversation or that I couldn't contribute anything of value to those conversations. And now I am becoming more confident in myself, and I'm becoming a little bit more like, you know what? No, like I'm going to voice my opinion, and my opinion is more of like a moderate, like, hey, like let's look at the full story here. Let's look at the full context. Let's also look at ourselves. In anthropology, it's called reflexivity. And in any anthropological study, you've got the person who is the scientist or the observer who goes through like pages of just like writing out this critical self-examination of like, who are you? What are your biases? What are your backgrounds? Because like all of that stuff, no matter what, the experiences that you've had in your life are going to warp your lens and kind of not dictate, but like it will impact and influence whatever you're observing and whatever you're discussing.
It does dictate it. Yeah, really, really strongly influence.
Yeah. And going back to your question about like, oh, is there a difference between like when, hey, you're the only minority growing up in a predominantly white community? I was that person. I was that person who was like, the one racially ambiguous like person in an all white situation. And at first, like, yeah, I definitely felt different. Like I wasn't a conventional beauty, so I never had like boys crushing on me. Like I was tall and developed very quickly. So like that was another like hard issue. But like as I got older, I did encounter like subtle racist things that at the time I was like, no, that can't be. It just means I have to work harder. So then I would like work harder to try and gain the approval of people that like I was never going to get their approval ever. And like now I look back and I'm like, oh yeah, that was kind of like shitty and racist. Like the one story that's blaring in my mind is like I was in AP history my freshman year of high school, and I had gone from a small school that was like maybe 60 people in my class to a school that had like 600 people in my class. So it became a lot more diverse. It became like a lot more people. So, and at my old school, I was like a big fish in like a small pond. And I was really like won every geography bee. I was just so social history minded.
That's awesome.
Which is like all of these things. Like I played into like my future and into my present day reality. But like I had this one history teacher, and she just like one day looked at me and was like, hey, after class, she was like, hey, what are you? The what are you question. And so I started to explain, and then she was like, oh, that's why you look different. And then, woof, like her treatment of me changed completely to the point where like she was like really rough on my grades.
Are you serious?
Dead serious. And then like I took the midterm, and my like I loved history and I loved geography. So world history should never have been an issue for me. But I had gotten my midterm back, and it wasn't like an F or anything. It was like an F failing with effort. It was a 45, like 45%. And so the other teachers like got involved, and they were like, hey, what happened to Kae Lani's test? Like she scored perfect on like everything. Cause I was like an overachiever, probably because of the mindset of like, oh, I'm seeing that I'm not getting this approval that everyone else is getting. I need to work a little bit harder. To gain these people's approval, and then come to find out it's like, oh, it's because I was different the entire time. Anyway, like then she corrected it, and I had gotten like a 98, and she was like, oh, I put the Scantron in upside down was her excuse.
Out. That's horrific.
I know, and like, but at the time I was like, oh, misunderstanding. Right. And now I look back and I'm like, no, that was a repetitive thing that I had to do. And then there were also situations where it was like when I was applying to college, like I had a history teacher, even though I love history, it was like my favorite subject was biting me in the butt. I had another history teacher that was like, oh, don't worry, you'll get in because you're a minority. And I was like, wow. That sucks.
That is so terrible.
And like that blew my mind that like that stuff could still, but even when it was happening to me, I don't know if it was because I was conditioned in a certain way, or like we talk about now with like women who are, you know, realizing like, oh wait, all this sexist stuff is happening to me. Like, cause we're conditioned to just be like, no, it can't be. Like, it's just a misunderstanding, and the misunderstanding is on our part. It's our responsibility to, you know, correct. But yeah,
it's so it's terrible that was happening, and just I can't even like what do you do when someone asks you a question like what are you? Like that seems like the most offensive.
It's
like
so stupid. I still answer it. I still like 2 days ago.
Because you're so polite. You were so nice. You're just really easygoing, and it's just like
I try. Like I am nice, and I just assume that people just are maybe curious.
Yeah, just from talking. Well, you said that was one of the first things you said in this conversation, that you're a naturally curious person. You can I just get the vibe from you. You're a peacemaker. You're not someone that's very easy to offend in this way, which is like it is like we said earlier on, this is a conversation that's like walking on eggshells, and a lot of people who try to have any kind of say in this conversation, they're really afraid to make any kind of statement, because any kind of misstep can really get you nailed.
I'm waiting for in 10 years a pull quote to come out of this conversation to destroy us both.
Because it will.
I know. Like I hope so. Like people listen to the entire conversation and make judgments for themselves. That like you don't have to agree with everything that I say, but if you can find some nuggets of truth that, you know, help you along your journey, that's cool too.
Right. Well, these kind of conversations are always so interesting to me, because from the perspective of different minority groups, you have so many different takes on how to manage your oppression? Like, how do you manage the deck of cards that you've been handed? And there's so many different, whether it's journalists or it's comedians or writers or academics, like you have the whole gambit of people that are providing different rhetorical outlets and explanations for younger, like for kids, for whether it's children or teenagers or young adults, on how to manage who they are and like what kind of life that they are given. In the case of minorities, it's just so interesting to me because you have the sort of, again, it all comes down to these left versus right dichotomies, because people on the right have that sort of bootstraps mentality. So like you see a lot of black conservatives on the right who really they put out this rhetoric that's much so of the idea that you need to just get through it. Like, you know, like you need to work, like you mentioned, like you felt like you had to work harder. Like that's a lot of what they push off. They're like, well, work harder. Like if you're experiencing racism, work harder, be better, push through it. Like that's the sort of mindset on that end. And then on the other far end of the left, you have the sort of victim mentality where then people say, well, if you have people constantly telling you that you're oppressed from a really, really young age, and that obviously affects you developmentally, because like now you're going through school, you're going through your jobs, and you have this in the back of your mind constantly. It's like a nagging voice in your head, I can imagine, where it's just you're constantly thinking like, what did, like, this person says something a little off color or offhand, maybe it's like could be taken the wrong way, and your immediate knee-jerk reaction then to that is, what did they just say? Like, what did they mean by that? And you get super, super defensive. So it's interesting how between the two sort of, those are extremes, and obviously there's everything in between and how people handle these conversations. But I'm always interested to understand more about the solutions, more about like how do we better understand this conversation at large, because it's just dynamite. You know, it's so difficult for like most of the people who grew up like in this town, like where I'm from, like this type of conversation, if it were to happen, it would most likely only be happening with a bunch of white people, and their understanding of that, like they would say in defense, they'd be like, well, our race shouldn't matter, we should be able to talk about this, but they wouldn't have a lot of the cultural context, even just the stories that you're bringing to the table here. Like that's so much of that is so foreign to a majority class group, you know? Yeah. So it's really...
And we can't help who we were born as and in what period that we were born in. Because like I did go through a period of time where I was angry, and I participated in a lot of Twitter outrage, and I participated in a lot of outrage. Actually, like, you know, my first encounter managing a social media account was Occupy Philly.
Okay.
Helped out with but I was also like 21, 22 at the time. Yeah. But I used to be so angry, and then I just was like, why continue to be angry? I can't help that, Native Americans don't get like props for popcorn anymore, or like I can by saying it, but there's so much damage that was done hundreds of years before any of us were even here. And I think that I just had to go, okay, accept, and now what can we do moving forward to make that better? And like even my own role as like a in the food and travel world is to tell stories properly, tell them the best that I can, involve the voices that need to be included in those stories, and elevate the stories that need to be heard. And that's that's literally what I can do. That is the immediate thing that I can do. I can't personally impeach Trump. I can't force what's his name? Chef Ramsay to cancel his National Geographic show. There was also another really ugly thing that happened in the world of like food this week, where a poke place, poke from Hawaii. Mm-mm. Oh, poke bowls. They're really delicious.
I don't think I've ever had one.
Really?
No, I don't think so.
Oh my goodness. It's become kind of, again.
Is it one of these new fads?
It's one of these food fads, but it's a dish from Hawaii. It's a native Hawaiian dish. And it's a rice bowl, and it's deconstructed like rice bowl with salmon chunks and some sauce and vegetables and everything. It's really delicious.
Sounds really good.
It's super good. But like it's become, again, a food fad. There's a ton of poke places in Philly now, but there was a place in Chicago called Aloha Poke, and then they trademarked the word aloha. And then, like,
can you do that?
I guess they
how
were
do you
able
do
to.
that?
They were able to, and then they wrote up cease and desist orders to all these other poke places, to natives in Hawaii, and said you can't call your poke place Aloha anymore.
Out.
And it's so disgusting. Of just like, ew, that was a native word that you just trademarked, and now every company, including native businesses run by natives, who that term is, so culturally important to them and their mindset. Like, you've taken that word, trademarked it, and now no one else is allowed to use that word. Now they have to pay for rebranding. And
I didn't even know that was possible. That's so absurd.
Like, I that story hit the airwaves, and it was like, well, where was the outrage of that? We got so outraged.
I didn't see anything about that.
We got so outraged at collard greens, and we just totally missed the poke.
Yeah, like the way people direct their anger, it is always so interesting to observe from the outside looking in. Because you're like, what? Some of the stuff that gets picked up on, you're like, why? Where did the seed of this anger originate, and why are we like so focused on this when we should be focused over here?
Yeah.
That happens every day with different stuff. I mean, of course, all the way down to the pop culture of someone like Kim Kardashian or Katy Perry. You have like the hyper-focused lens on the people who are in pop culture, which when we should be, covering much more important issues. But yeah, it's really... You said something interesting in there that I wanted to go back to just for a second, where you were talking about like how when you were younger you had this anger like a few years ago, and how you kind of now developed like a new mindset toward like what you can do, what your place is. And I think that's such an important note to throw in there for people, because I think anger, like young people in general are angry.
Yeah.
Like I was the most angry teenager, young adult ever. And
it's that rebellion
you just
too, of
rebel.
like, oh yeah, we've got opinions and we're right, and like,
you developed your ego. You're rebelling against your family, and now what you throw on top of that, the cultural anger.
I think there was a little bit of fitting in too, because it was like you get a lot of like traction when you.
Oh my God, yeah.
You do. You there is like a little bit of social media currency to like within, what is it now, 280 characters now?
Yeah.
It used to be 140. Like, that's not a full story. Like,
They're sound bites.
They're sound bites.
Yeah.
They're hot takes, and you really need to look at the full picture. Like, I had to take a step back and go, what am I really angry at? Am I angry at this situation, or am I angry because my circle of influence is also angry? And am I angry because I want to seem like I fit in, and I want to seem like I have a little bit of moral superiority? And I had to really reflect on that and go, is this anger? Because it started to like make me physically ill and just stressed out all of the time.
Of course.
And so I had to reflect and really analyze and think to myself, okay, let me read the full story. Let me read the full background rather than get all up in a tizzy and add to this anger. And I think that's a little bit more responsible. I think it would be more responsible if more people stepped up and said, hey, you know what? Here's a perspective that I'm not seeing out on the airwaves. How about, I think that's why I really loved that Michael Twitty came up and talked about collard greens, and the history of it was like he told his own community, like, actually, take a step back, breathe, and let's look at the context of it. Context collapse is...
Yeah, it's a real thing.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, too, with everything you said there. Like, again, going back to how I'm at least perceiving your demeanor. You're a very easygoing, easy to talk to person. So it seems, like with anger for someone like you, with your demeanor, that would just brush so harshly up against who you are as a person, So it's also, it's a combination, I think, too, of what emotions people can utilize to either better themselves and or the world in some capacity. Because some people, when they get angry, they're able to like harness that anger and use it towards some cause. They can use it. That's like, I'm pretty sure I forget who quoted that, but I think it might have been Martin Luther King Jr. It's like the quote of who, like, anger on its own like it just diffuses, it goes out in a day or whatever. But when you use anger toward a cause of injustice or some deeper motivation, like that's the thing. I think people get lost in outrage culture where you have the seed of injustice, where it's something like Trump's election or a Gordon Ramsay opening up or doing this whole show, whatever it might be, and there's a good intent with that seed that gets you stirred up. But then oftentimes, instead of kind of keeping your eye on the bullseye, people lose sight of where the anger actually came from, and that just becomes outrage for the sake of outrage. And if you're someone who doesn't manage that well, like that'll destroy you. Like you can't.
Or you might say something that in a couple years is actually like not that conducive. Like how many people are beginning to like lose jobs over what they say on Twitter,
tweets,
or like what things that people are posting online. It's like, it's not conducive to finding any solutions. And so there's like conversations out in the travel world. It's like, well, why is there no female food host? And it's like, well, yeah, that's an issue. Like we're missing that perspective. Why is there no like POC, like person of color or black host on a food television show,
right.
Like, or in the vein of Anthony Bourdain, like why is there
at that level?
That level, why is that missing? And so that's something to explore. But on top of that, why don't we try to be that? If it like, that's open, and it might be hard, and you might be like, for instance, like I've been a woman who has, in some cases, been the only person in a directorial position at a company. So before I was at USA Today, I was with another company, and I was the only woman on like the managerial level. And that experience opened my eyes to like a deeper issue where like there is like this patriarchal issue of like, white dudes sometimes only want to hear from white dudes. And every time I would step up with like actual facts or reports or ideas, I was met with skepticism. Like they didn't believe what I was saying.
It's like that meme where like, let me interrupt your expertise with my confidence or whatever it is.
My confidence.
Yeah, because that's exactly what it is.
It truly was. And I found myself for 2 years at this company as the director of social media. And I found myself in this situation where, I was spending more time justifying what I was doing and explaining what I was doing and giving support to myself for my own decisions to how to run my department and in conjunction with other departments than actually doing the work. That like they would scrutinize me so vehemently. And it wasn't that like, I don't know why, like, I don't know if there was like a level of competition there or maybe there was something inside of them that they had to reflect on of like, well, why don't we trust Kae Lani? Why do we question her, or why haven't we empowered her in any valuable way, or why haven't we been giving her the support that she needs? And I think that happens a lot in, of course, media, and of course in a lot of other industries, tech, and
tech's huge.
It's huge with that of just like, well, there is an issue of there's no like female or black hosts of food television channels, because as you go up the chain, like the people who thought up of the idea of Gordon Ramsay Uncharted, where he's going to compete with local communities to see if they can cook their local cuisine better, that is a result of probably a bunch of white men in a writer's room, and there's no representation. Because even if you had like one woman or one person of color in that room, they would have just been like, actually,
that's like, something.
That's an issue, and here's why. Yeah. And I think it's like, when you're in that bubble, you're literally not even thinking.
Right.
You're just not thinking about, representation. You're just thinking like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to send Chef Ramsay on all these trips?
It's sort of become like the blueprint of what they find successful with their network. So it's like if the blueprint has traditionally been like these white more enthusiastic, confident men, then that's just what, like, if the network sees success in there, then it's like they, just from a money standpoint, they don't want to branch outside and be more diverse, because there's definitely, and that's the same issue with the hierarchical systems of whether it's tech companies or just a lot of business in general, and how it regards women in leadership positions, because we don't traditionally value the temperamental traits of women in the same sense as we do of men. Or like men, generally speaking, men do exude that like high level of competition and confidence that like pushes them through in a lot of these like board meetings where you're just talking over each other, and it's like about who's the loudest, like who can be the most persuasive, and that's just what we've, I think, in a lot of like business cultures have valued in our leader. I mean, just look at Trump. Like that's what we value in our leadership.
Just loud and brash, and he doesn't even know anything, but he comes in with bravado and confidence that is just like, oh, okay, I can follow. I can get behind that. Yeah. I can blindly follow that.
So it's definitely a mix there. It's definitely a mix of like I think that's a huge, I love that topic of conversation, because it's such a like a nuanced discussion point where you have, again, people on the right side of the spectrum who tend to ignore like the gender differences and the issues of women in the workplace specifically. Like, just to take that as an example, like they look at that and they say, well, like that we can account for that because, you know, more men like this job, or more men are prone to excel in this field. And they kind of point to studies and stats and all that. Like, so I can conceive that maybe there's some level of whatever fraction of like the percentages, like it has to do with that. Like I can concede to generalizations. Like I think there are certain generalized traits when you look between genders in the workplace, and you can account for that. But I think oftentimes what they miss is the whole other side of the conversation, which is these differences in how
and we've been socialized.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Women have been socialized to, like, you know, I have this example all the time of like, oh, when you enter the boardroom and you're the only woman that's in the boardroom, you're more likely to be the one that gets the coffee, prepares the tea, and is the note taker.
And everybody's making comments on you because you are the only woman in the room. So
or I, like, a long time ago, before I was fully in the travel writing and editorial space, I was like manager for like a facilities company. Real boring stuff. Super boring. Not as exciting as what I do today. But I remember like my female VP like being like, "Kae, you've got great ideas, but you have to make it look like it's the men's idea in order for it to get done."
That's the thing.
And I just hated the idea of like, first off, like priming. You're like priming this person to try and feed them your idea. And then like when you give it to them and then they regurgitate your own idea back at you to be like, oh, what a great idea. How I didn't think of it myself.
That's the corporate world. Yeah, there's so many instances too where then that like that situation, then as it progresses through someone like a woman's career, then you become more and more like gender stereotypical to men. You become more assertive, like you're forced to become, you adapt almost these traits, which in a lot of cases are counterintuitive to who you are, like from like your personality. Like if you were, as a person who is more easygoing and like just very like down to earth, like if you were forced into an environment where you had to compete and it's like the survival of the fittest type of thing.
I don't compete. I'm just like,
yeah, you're like, what?
But so I'll show up and do my thing.
Yeah. So if you were forced, like it could be terrible for your mental health.
Yeah.
You know, like that, and that's what happens, I think, in a lot of cases. And you can't win. Like I know women in the workplace who are more assertive, like have more of those masculine traits, and they're still ridiculed for those traits. So
exactly,
it's like,
for those traits, exactly. Yeah. Luckily, like I love what I do with the USA Today 10 Best team, and like I have an amazing boss who he just like gives me a lot of creative liberty and like trusts me. And that's like
awesome.
What's so bizarre is like it's the first job in my career where I've actually had this male boss that's like, yeah, run with it. Like,
Wow.
lets me, like the way that Eat Sip Trip got started was, my husband and I had a fake Facebook page that we called Foodful Thinking. And every Friday night, it was actually a way for me to test out Facebook Live when it was a new product.
Oh, cool.
And I had to learn how to use it and make sure I knew what I was doing before I took it to that company where all the men looked at me with skepticism. So I had created this case study, and the case study was called Foodful Thinking. And we had this fake show on Friday nights called Friday Night Cookies. And we would dive into the history and the backstory and the culture of cookies that we love and eat. So it'd be the Oreo for an episode, or it'd be the chocolate chip cookie and how that was created, or the drama that is the world of Keebler elves. And so we had an episode every week with that. And by episode 4, the page exploded. And at the end of it all, we had 28 million video views, had over 40,000 followers, didn't spend any money on it. Didn't spend any money. But I think it was during a time, it was that short window of time when Facebook put a priority on Facebook Live because they wanted it. Yeah, it was new. And so anytime you did a Facebook Live, it would just hit everyone's newsfeed. Would you be able to build a brand like Foodful Thinking now with Facebook Live? I don't think so. So it was this sweet spot of we found this weird, the case study was really fascinating. My other company didn't buy it, but I don't care because the company I work for now totally was nice. And yeah.
Why wouldn't they buy it? It's the proof's in the pudding, people. It worked.
It worked.
What's to buy?
I went to them and they got hung up on the fact that it was my husband and I in our dirty South Philly apartment. Literally my cat would sometimes jump up on the table and get into the camera.
That's what the people want. They want authenticity.
Dude, they did. And it got to the point where we started a Instagram account for my cat because people were like, Geronimo is back. People got so excited. There was a couple of videos.
That's it.
Yeah, there was a couple of videos where I had this trash bag full of clothes that I was meaning to donate in the background. So for a few weeks of the episode, there's just this trash bag on the living room floor.
Were people calling it out in the videos? Or?
No, people were just all about the content and the cat. And content and cats. That's the internet.
That's great. That's so true.
And so my other company got hung up on the concept of they thought the videos were stupid, and I was yeah, they probably are, but I don't care. We identified this market. Yeah, we identified this market that was really interested not just in the food that we were eating, but in the history and the culture and the context of the food, which was this groundbreaking thing of in a time, and that was during a time when listicles were still hot. I don't know if listicles are
off my radar.
Oh, listicles?
Yeah.
Whoa. Okay. So in the editorial world, those quick hits, those top 10 things that's
BuzzFeed.
Yeah, BuzzFeed.
Oh, that's what you call them.
BuzzFeed. We call it listicles. So there was also context breakdown with just journalism in general, where everyone was reading listicles, and listicles were doing well. But we identified this need for long form writing and long form storytelling. So when I got hired at USA Today, I brought the Foodful Thinking idea to them, and then we rebranded that and turned it into Eat Sip Trip. And that's
amazing.
That's what it's founded on, was this fake Facebook page that we set up.
I'm so happy that actually worked, and it's so cool that and it's all context. I think it's really cool too how years ago when what do you call them, listicles? I'd never heard that term. I guess I'm just totally. There's some things I swear. Maybe it's just my bad memory. Maybe I don't know, out of the loop. But it's interesting how when those started to become popular, there was that sort of cultural fear. Everybody's oh my gosh, all we do is pay attention to headlines. It's all buzz titles. No one wants to read anything. We can only read 10 words at a time, and people are really concerned about the long form reading of newspapers and articles. And it is interesting how now that has sort of come back around. A lot more people crave those in-depth pieces. We want to know more about
They want to hear those quirky stories. They want to hear where the things that are in their immediate reality, where they come from, who inspired them, what are those stories? Because a lot of them are just bizarre and great and fantastic. And so that's what I get to explore with my team, which is really, really fun. But in making my dream job, I also have the opportunity to make dream jobs for other people, which is engaging them and saying like, oh, you know that dish that you grew up with in Cincinnati, like the Cincinnati chili, like give us a story about the Cincinnati chili, or like give us this story about, the fusion of Thai and Chinese cuisine, and how like, I think someone wrote this article that was like, the best Chinese food you'll have is not even in China, it's in Thailand.
Wow.
And it was like how those cultures mix. And like, I would never have read that if it weren't for like people that come from those backgrounds and come from those perspectives.
Yeah.
And it just like expanded my world as well.
I think that curiosity is just so important on this whole topic of conversation that we've hit a lot of different areas, but like the whole thing revolves around like generating curiosity for understanding for people versus, pushing divisiveness and outrage. And there's that sort of, like which do you want? Because you're only going to get one. If you want someone to listen, I forget what the study was. I shouldn't even say this because I don't have the cited study. I think it was a couple universities put the study together years ago. It was around baseball teams. It wasn't around food, but it was around baseball teams, and they pitted people with more conservative ideologies against people with more liberal ideologies. And I think it might have been over the Washington like Redskins, like one of these names for a team that was like more of an issue. And what they found was that like they were testing individuals and from where their ideologies were formed, and they found that people from more liberal ideologies are and this is cited in other studies, so I guess it doesn't really matter that I can't remember what this one's called, because you can find these all over the place. But people with more liberal ideologies, their sensitivities are more malleable in general. It's not just that more liberal-minded people get more outraged; they're just more sensitive in general. Like they find like the highs and the lows, like the more careful, I guess, in that way. Whereas conservatives, obviously you have cases of racism and all that with that far end of the spectrum, but the people that were tested on this, it didn't actually change their perception positively or negatively when they were tested on it. So it's just interesting how like the effect, I think, that a lot of these incidences have, they just affect people with different temperamental mindsets so differently. So like when you generate a hit piece or like weaponize a certain term like cultural appropriation at a group of people who, yes, like you can have all the facts or the proper perspectives in it that you want. You can say, yes, it's about class, it's about white privilege. You can have all these terms that like you can have terms that are easily defendable from your position, but when you weaponize it toward a group of people, they're just going to shut down because from their perspective, I mean, we see this all the time, these conversations where you have white people saying, I'm not racist, like I don't see color, and then people on the other side saying, well, that means you're racist. And like from their perception, in a lot of cases, not every case, obviously there's obvious clear cases of racism, there's obvious clear cases where this is blown into different biases and proportions, but in a lot of the context of individuals who have more conservative minded ideologies, they honestly just aren't as affected. Like they literally, like it's something in the way their brain is developed. Like they don't get a lot of the negative or the positive connotations that come with a lot of these stories. So I think if you can plant a curiosity in them, if you can plant more of that educational, like reaching across the aisle, like let's talk about this in a way that's not just shutting down an entire race or an entire group of individuals, I think that's so important because like I think more and more people are becoming open to it as I hate separating people into like moderate versus extremists because I think there are like useful people in all ends of the spectrum. It's not like all extremists are bad and all moderates are good or anything like that. But I think having more moderate voices like yourself who are willing to engage and actually invoke that curiosity is so important because without that, how can they learn? Like if someone makes a mistake and like say someone loves Gordon Ramsay's new show and then hears that people are outraged about it and then they get defensive, like, wait, well, I just love the show. Like, I don't understand. If their first reaction is defensiveness, like how are they supposed to learn from that? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think so when you're saying with the baseball study that more liberal-minded people have more sensitivity. I'm going to look it up right now while you're talking. Yeah, sure. I think like maybe that is a spectrum of empathy that like I feel like maybe there is this collective outrage that happens a lot because it's like, oh, if our friend is angry, well, we're gonna be there for you. Like, if you're angry, well, I'm angry because I love you and I care for you, and whatever is hurting you is now hurting me. And I think empathy can be a very powerful tool when you lower those defenses and you say, okay, to, like, empathy is that is a hard practice, but like, extend empathy to maybe someone that is across the aisle and say, you know what? Oh, you grew up in like rural Kansas. You didn't get to experience a full range of different cultures. You didn't get to have different types of cuisines in your neighborhood. You had just this like homogenized community, and anything outside of that, like for instance, I look back at my past position as like the social media director at a previous company, the men who looked at me with skepticism. Yeah, of course I was totally angry at the sexism at first, but then I was like, I tried to extend empathy to them, and I was like, oh, I get it. They were threatened because what's worse than competing with another guy is competing with a woman. And what is worse, like, that must have rattled their brains. It made them so afraid. They couldn't handle that maybe a woman was better at something, or maybe a woman was smarter in this particular type of thing. So, like, instead of getting like, so what's going on with Gordon Ramsay? I mean, like, let's extend some empathy to him. He hasn't had a show in a long time. His brand is this angry, toxic chef. Although, didn't he have like the nightmare hotels? Like, recently he got into hotels.
I don't even follow Gordon. I'm so out of the...
No, it's all good.
He's like Guy Fieri to me. He's memeable. I'm just like, oh, he's funny. Like, I don't really...
Yeah. Just like, why are you so threatened? Why are you... Yeah. So, like, in my right now, it might be hard, and people might call me an apologist for trying to extend some type of empathy and get, like, I want to get into the minds of people to understand, well, why do you think this way?
Yeah.
Where's the common ground that we can find to create a solution to something that's going to work for everyone, where everyone gets credit where credit is due? And yeah, it is a hard practice. I understand.
Yeah, because people do, like, they consider, in often cases when people talk like that, they think it's minimalizing. They think it's like you're now enabling the behavior of these people who are putting out, whether it's racist or sexist or borderline racist, sexist, where there's some sort of ambiguity to it. Like, there's that sort of idea where you become an apologist if you're trying to understand, which I just don't. I only buy it if it's not backed up by actual character and content. You know what I mean? Like there are people, I think, who do just become apologists. Like, there's tons of examples I can think of this, where someone starts out with one type of rhetoric. The perfect example I use a lot on the show, I don't know if you'd follow him. His name's Dave Rubin.
No.
It's more in the political sphere. He's one of these characters who he started a prominent YouTube show. He used to work for the Young Turks, and he started a prominent YouTube show on his own, like 2014, 15, leading up to the election cycle. And his whole bit was, he's a gay, married Jewish man. He'd always talk about, like, that's his identity. And he's from the left, like, he's coming out of the Young Turks. So he based the premise of his YouTube series, like, news show, off of, I'm someone, like, from this political party, and I want to clean up my own house. Like, I want to extend a hand to the other side and have good conversation and improve discourse, because discourse is getting so toxic between political parties. So a lot of people were craving that, obviously, because people, like, in the midst, like, of these issues, like, all these big issues are from Black Lives Matter or feminism, like, all, like, within or post Gamergate, like, all leading into the 2016 election. A lot of people were, like, really just fed up and confused, and they felt like they couldn't have a voice. Like, just like you were saying, you at a time felt like, I shouldn't be writing about any of this.
Oh yeah,
I think a lot of people.
I'm part of these communities. I'm like an active participant in, like, I've been to Black Lives Matter marches. Like, I stand behind that mission, and yet I just, like, didn't know where my voice fit in, and I didn't want to be a voice I didn't want to represent something, like, and mess up or do something wrong. And
that was the mindset of so many people in that time. So when this guy came out, like, it was so appealing. He got a mass audience almost instantly, just from people that were interested in that sort of bridging the gap mentality. And now, over the course of the past 4 or so years, he's had this show of his. He's essentially become a right-wing apologist, where it started out like, well, I don't know the guy. I don't know what his intentions are. All I can speak to is the rhetoric and the content he's putting out. And like, from the content that I'm viewing and dissecting, like, all I see is like right-wing associations, and it's not about discourse. It's not about like sharing this equal exchange of ideas. It's like 90+% of the guests on his show are just libertarian or conservative pundits, and he doesn't have any equal representation from the other side or pushback to their ideas. So like, he's a perfect example of someone who, like, stereotypically in this sense became an apologist in a lot of ways for the sort of idea of like bridging the gap. So I see it. You see it everywhere with people that
right.
it happens to.
But we have to make sure not to conflate these issues of just like, okay, let's do like a cultural appropriation example. So have you ever heard of Cook's burrito, like a cart in Portland, that story?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Those 2 women that went, yes. Yeah. Tell the story for people who don't know.
2 women drive down to Mexico on a Christmas break or vacation or whatever, and they go to this town that specializes in lobster tacos. And so they fall in love with the tortillas, and so they ask around in Spanish, about, hey, what's in these tortillas? What are these tortillas made of? And the abuelitas who make the tortillas told them bits and pieces, but not like the full story. And whether or not, like, it's very unclear because all we have is like 2 sentences from an interview. Yeah. So basically, they get elements of the recipe from the abuelitas in Mexico. They watch through windows, like how they made it look so easy that it was done. And then they came home and they tried to recreate from their memory, like, these recipes, but they fuddy-duddied around with it and ended up like creating a recipe that they liked, that was theirs. And so they opened up like a burrito cart in Portland, and it was open, I believe, for a little bit until the Willamette Gazette interviewed them on the success of their burrito cart. And so there was like 2 sentences. It was a quote by one of the girls, and she said, oh yeah, like, we asked in broken Spanish about the recipe and we got little bits and pieces, and then we were looking through the windows, like, seeing how they were easily made. That's like a abridged version of the quote. Mm-hmm. That quote was pulled out, and I wonder if I can find it on MIC. Okay, so the original interview. Okay, and here's her quote. I picked the brains of every tortilla lady there in the worst broken Spanish ever, and they showed me a little what they did, Connolly says. They told us the basic ingredients, and we saw them moving and stretching the dough similar to how pizza makers do before rolling it out with pins. They wouldn't tell us too much about technique, but we were peeking into windows of every kitchen, totally fascinated by how easy they made it look. We learned quickly, and it isn't quite that easy. And so that's from the Willamette. Then where this became a national outrage story was Mike's response. They created an article, and the title was, "The White Cooks Bragged About Stealing Recipes from Mexico to Start a Portland Business." And it was like,
what a title.
Oh, totally. I'd click on that.
Yeah.
I think I did actually click on it. And like, I remember reading it and being like, can you believe these white chicks, John? Like, John's my husband. I'd be like, can you believe these white chicks just straight up stole this recipe? But then I read more about it and I started reading more of the background. And so literally, like, there was such outrage over it because of how Mike presented it. And their article was really, really short. And only pulled that little quote out of the original interview, and people just like blew up, and they were like, they stole this recipe. They knew exactly what they were doing. They went in, infiltrated this Mexican abuelita community, and like stole the recipe to line their pockets with the profits. And, you know, that was on one extreme. And so the things like, there are some things that they did wrong where it's like, okay, you do have to give credit to the people that, you know, you got this recipe from, that inspired this recipe.
Yeah.
Perhaps, you know, pay these women for sharing that information for you, like some type of licensing fee or something, or like, you know, create a fund or like donate some of your proceeds to helping Mexican communities in Portland, because Portland is an extremely white city. It's not that diverse, but however, there are growing communities, immigrant communities coming to Portland. So there's things that could have been done right, but the reaction to this was like within 24 hours, their burrito shack was like closed down.
Yeah, they shut down. Yeah.
They shut down. They were receiving death threats. They were at the end of a lot of outrage, and people were extremely angry and like directed a lot of aggression at them. And nowhere in any of that, like, I don't know. I don't think that they deserved death threats. Definitely didn't deserve death threats. There are things that they could have done better. There are definitely things that there could have been a compromise on, but like they traveled. They weren't racist. They traveled. They loved the community so much. They loved the food so much. They were so inspired by it. They were driven by this curiosity, and they wanted to share that with people at home. And so, you know, me even saying that, like, oh, you got to take all of these elements into consideration is like, I'm wondering if people will think I'm an apologist for saying that, for even saying the things that I'm saying right now, and not just saying this blanket statement of like, no, they were colonists, they Columbused this recipe, and they are racist for doing so. Like, there's some people in my communities on the left that would want me to say that, but I don't necessarily truly believe it is that extreme.
Yeah, I think a lot of the issue, again, on the topic of race in general, a lot of it comes down to the sort of systematic views versus the individual setting views, where like this is a case, like you said, there's more context to these women's history and like who they are. And I think like sort of grouping them in and just saying like they Columbused the situation, like they are just participating in like the neo-colonialism of Western civilization, like that like at its face value is wrong. But I think there's a systematic critique of neocolonialism, like that, where you could make the point of saying, well, since this is so just broadly accepted in America and Western culture, like this is just sort of like with these cooking shows and these restaurants opening up in gentrified areas, like this is just something that's accepted as the norm. So when you have two women who maybe personally weren't racist, but they were raised in this culture where this is sort of like normalized, then they participate in it. So like there's that systematic critique, which I definitely take to heart. But then there's also like the whole flip side of that, which when you can't make all these huge life-altering, damaging assumptions off these two individuals who you really don't have any context for by saying those things.
Exactly. And we don't know them personally. Mike, their title of like bragged about stealing recipes. They probably didn't even think that they were stealing recipes. It didn't,
like, just that quote that you read doesn't sound like it was bragging.
But that was what the entire article from Mike was built upon, was that one line. And it's probably not the best way to run a business, but at the same time, it's like, well, you're eating that burrito, you know it's not authentic because it's two white chicks making it. But we also go to Chipotle, and we don't think that is...
or Taco Bell.
Or Taco Bell. That is not Mexican cuisine at all. It is the American interpretation of Mexican cuisine, which, there's a lot of American interpretation of food. There's an American interpretation of Chinese food. There's an American interpretation of Indian food. Well, that's more of a British interpretation of Indian food.
Yeah, like, do you know the origin story of Taco Bell with like the owner, that whole thing? So I'm looking up real quick right now because it's interesting how I want to get this restaurant right. Where is the restaurant? It's not even coming up on Google. This is bad. This is systematic. It should be coming up on Google right away. This, long story short, I'm fairly certain that the story with the history of the owner of the founder of Taco Bell was that there's a Mexican restaurant chain that had actually been around for over a decade, probably I think like 20-something years prior to the origins of Taco Bell, that the owner would visit and loved the food there. And apparently for like, I don't know if it was months or years, he was trying to steal the recipe ideas.
Oh my
and I guess
goodness.
the owner of this Mexican place just basically like knew that that's what he was up to, and was basically like, hey, we know you, like, you're trying to take our stuff, like, let me just teach it to you, like, I don't care. So he actually became friends with him, and he actually went to his house and showed him how to make his food, and then he's the guy then that made Taco Bell. And apparently there's some piece, I don't know why it's not coming up on Google, there's a piece, I don't know if it was an investigative journalist piece that came out recently where someone actually found the restaurant. It's still around. It's been around for like 75 years, I think, something like that. They found the family of the restaurant, and they were basically like, yeah, like we don't care. Like, it's like they were very chill about the whole thing, which was really interesting because like I'd never heard, when I read about that, like I'd never heard that type of take on, like, in reaction to a situation like this, which usually it is the outrage culture that usually fixates on something like that. Whereas with this, at least I'm trying to find it right now with the
that is why, and it, like, yeah, so that was that man's personal choice to teach that other person,
to share it
and share that with him. That's fascinating.
I want to get this name. Like, I feel it should be on their is it Mitla? Oh wait, here you go. That's on the wiki page. Mitla Cafe or Mitla. I don't know how to pronounce this. Let's see if it's still. Yeah, Mitla. It's Mitla Cafe. It says Mitla is the restaurant that birthed Taco Bell. Here we go. So this is just like the first sentence of this article. Yeah, it says like this. It was written in 2012. So this week marks the 50th anniversary of Taco Bell, but this year also marks the 75th anniversary of Mitla Cafe, which is a diner off the historic Route 66 in San Bernardino, and it's the oldest Mexican restaurant in the Inland Empire and one of the oldest Mexican restaurants in Southern California. And then let me see here. So it looks like the story is in a book. Okay, so this is in the book that the owner published called Taco USA, How Mexican Food Conquered America, which the owner of Taco Bell wrote. And it says he tells the story of this in here. So yeah, super
That's
crazy.
So cool. I didn't even know that, because there was recently a video that BuzzFeed did, which was like there's like a series of kind of playing on the cultural appropriation side. So like BuzzFeed is doing this series of videos where it's like they bring in people from those cultures to eat the kind of like American bastardized versions of their food and comment and critique them. And it was like, the cultural appropriation of like Mexican food in America, but they served them Taco Bell. And I was like, Taco Bell?
That's like not a good example.
No, it was a terrible example. At least it's like Chipotle, maybe.
Yeah. Like no one, I don't even know anyone that eats a Taco Bell anymore.
My husband likes it.
Really?
Yeah.
Sorry, your husband.
No, I don't eat there. I don't eat there because I'm sure like it would wreck my stomach. Like I understand.
Yeah.
Like I know my body's limits, what it can and can't take. But I mean, chefs have gotten flack for this for like a while, of like when there's a white chef doing a cuisine that's not from their culture, like what do you do? Like there's two chefs that come up prominently. It's Andy Ricker, who has a restaurant in Portland called Pak Pak, where he backpacked in Thailand, and his first time going was like in 1987, but he every year spends a few months in Thailand to learn and has like a community in Thailand that teaches him this food. But like there's people that think that Pak Pak should be like shut down, but even Jonathan Gold reviewed it back in 2015, and even in his review he acknowledged cultural appropriation and said, yeah, this is a thing, but like Andy Ricker's Pak Pak is different, that like they're not one and the same.
Yeah, I read about him, and he had such like a deep appreciation of the culture, and like he's one of these people who was always like trying to like emphasize it over and over again, like this is.
And that restaurant opened up in November of 2005 during a time when Thai food was not, mainstream. It wasn't like generally accepted. People still didn't know about it. We were like cautious about it. But there are so many cases in the United States where like sometimes the only way they're going to experience another food is when like a more prominent restaurant gets put up in their town, or like maybe someone who loves Mexican food travels to Mexico, learns the language, like there's a cultural exchange there, and he comes back and like maybe opens a restaurant, and like maybe within that community that's like their first time experiencing Mexican food, and in that experience like they know it's like probably not real or legit, but maybe that'll inspire them to explore that cuisine further. Maybe it'll inspire them to travel to that place. I think that's what Rick Bayless did in Chicago. He traveled to Mexico when he was a kid and just loved the food there. And then at one point in 1978 to 1979, he had a show on PBS about Mexican cooking. I think it was called Mexican Cooking. And he opened his first restaurant that had Mexican cuisine. I think it's called Topo La Bampo. I've never been. Topo Lo Bampo. That was opened in 1989. So you're talking about this restaurant now that's been operating for almost 30 years. And people are now having an issue with it.
Yeah,
and
because it's hot in the media.
Yeah, but then you're just like, well, wait a minute. Look at this chef. And like, there is still this conversation of like, okay, maybe they could be doing more. Like, as culture is changing and as we are becoming more moral and understanding like our colonial past, like, okay, Rick Bayless and Andy Ricker, like, okay, we recognize that you are both giving credit to that culture. You took the time to educate yourself on that culture. But now it's time to also give back to that culture, and I think both of them are trying in their own way.
Yeah. There's always that that sort of left-leaning rhetorical phrase of like, we need to do better, which gets memed by people on the right because it is like a constant. It's never the job is never done. Like, there's a truth to it. Like, there's like the job of improving upon these situations isn't something that just like ends overnight. It's not like we hit this historical landmark when all of a sudden like history is erased and we all start with a clean slate, which I think a lot of people wish was the case. But in cases like you mentioned there, I think a lot of these situations, like they revolve around globalism. Like the world is shrinking, like with travel and like a lot of it, most of it, I would go as far to say is, I'm not a geopolitical scholar, but I'd venture to say a lot of it has to do with colonialism. A lot of it is nations invading other nations and taking parts of their culture back to where they were from.
That's how we got a lot of the foods that we
have. We have all of it.
Pasta sauce, coffee, chocolate, all of chocolate forever. Yep. Like, all those things are New World foods. But yeah, and food kind of drove colonialism. Yeah. There's like scholars out there in the foodways world that talk about like much of colonization was driven by food and by our hunger for new flavors and by like our thirst for just like new cuisines and new things. It kind of was driven, and of course like new land, like there's other things as well, but like one of the driving forces was just like new flavors, new foods, new like land to create new crops and new business and new opportunities. But like Mark Twain's quote, like about travel, and it's just like, it's hard for me to think that like a traveler could have, like, when I hear the word racist, it's so hateful, it's full of hate, and it to me it's more intentional. It's more intentional hate, where if it's more of a subconscious bias, it's more of a prejudice that you might have, like, but racism is like fully hate, fully intentional. And so when I hear the words of like, when people are exploring new lands and new foods as being a racist thing, I'm just like, can it be though? Is it?
Yeah, dude, the word, it's so split between those meanings. Like when you like systematic racism versus like personal like engagement of racism. Like they're just they get intermixed so often in how we use them.
I love Mark Twain's quote, which is, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime.
I love that.
Yeah, me too. Of just like, he's inspiring people. Like, if you want to have your perspective changed in any way, go see how life is done in another way. Go eat another person's food. Go learn a new perspective, and then come back and then, like, you know, like, help people escape the narrow-mindedness. Like, travel and food has, for me, always been an eye-opening thing. And so when I see people narrowing it down to, reducing it down to something so hateful, it's like, oh, it's like, it could be such a powerful tool to help people, you know, come together and create more understanding. There's nothing more powerful than engaging with another group that is different than you and has different ideas than you and has different perspectives than you. And like, I don't want to see that get lost. And I don't want people to feel like they're not allowed to, like, make kimchi at home, or
right,
or like go eat a burrito, or go travel to another country and rent an Airbnb. Like, there's that constant conflation. It's the constant conflation where people, they hear a lot of the rhetorical arguments and conversations happening around the cultural appropriation, and that's what they hear. They hear, well, wait, what do you mean I can't cook this? What do you mean I can't travel here? What do you mean I can't? It doesn't mean that you can't. It just means to be more mindful of it, to insert that critical thinking. And just like, I think food tastes so much more delicious when you understand where it comes from, and the people that it comes from, and the stories that are behind it, and the traditions. And like, it's just this intimate relationship with the culture that you're engaging with that can break down so many barriers and create a lot of equality. Yeah, but it can be, there is this thin line between cultural appropriation and cultural change. And it's just about being able to bridge that gap and give credit where credit is due.
I love that. Yeah, and I think so much of that, it's like we're caught between these two worlds. We're caught between the world of sort of the Instagram instant, you know, we want that authentic experience, like we've been saying, where people they're going after these culture, not just food, but just broader cultural appropriation versus cultural exchange, where people are in a lot of ways looking for ways to just further their own personal identity, which often involves exploitation of other cultures. So you have that sort of instant self-fulfilling aspect, and then you also have the people like the Anthony Bourdains, who are really people, you know, in the tragedy of his death, which is just, it's awful, and not to make light, and like I hate when people say things like, well, you know, like he died, but now everything's better off because he died. But so not to say, or you know, like his death is what created some better off situation. Like, so not to say that, but to say, you know, in his death, so many people started to like watch his shows. Like, he's just like when Michael Jackson died. It's like everybody listens to his albums. Like, it's people in doing that, you know, people are getting this experience of someone who really highlighted the culture. You know, like you've been saying, made it about the culture.
Yeah, it wasn't about him, and he did it in a way that was so respectful and so humble. And that's what's lacking on social media, and that's what's lacking in the look at me realms of the internet, like Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. All of it is like, look at me and look at the thing that I'm doing. Look at me and look at how cool I am. And look at me and look at, hey, everybody,
we all do it.
Look at me. But like, what's missing from that, like those quick hits and those quick captions, is the context of the thing that they are doing, of the place that they are in. And like, people need to step back and maybe realize that, like, you know what, the beautiful temple in Thailand that you're standing in front of, there's a story there, and it's more of a story than like, look at me in front of this pretty thing. Like, please give us this story and share that. Share what you've learned. What did you learn in that place?
Yeah.
Like, how did that place impact you? I think those are deeper questions. If you need writing prompts for Instagram, to have it be more impactful and more mindful and more meaningful than just, look at me at this place eating this food.
Yep. That's exactly what it is. It's like that. The same with style. Like, there's certain fashions where it's just like, look at me and this Native American dress.
Don't
like,
reduce it to that, because everything that you're engaging with has this story behind it.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to we can end it here. We've been going on forever, but
Sorry.
I wanted to no, don't apologize. This has been great. I totally forgot earlier to bring it up. I did find that study, just for anyone listening who is interested in it. It's called Activating Stereotypes with Brand Imagery, the role of viewer political identity. So it's just like an abstract between a bunch of different universities, University of Montana and Washington, and then Washington State University. Participated in it. But anyway, so if anyone's interested in looking that study up, it's really, really interesting just in how the different exposures to these issues affect people with different temperaments and how we can use that sort of baseline knowledge to bridge these gaps between larger group identities, which is so...
Know your audience? You mean
know
like
your
the
audience,
core of marketing?
The brand term. Know your audience, 101, just...
Learn how to speak to them, because it's like, your messaging, nothing you have to ever say. You can get red in the face and yell and lose your voice and run out of breath and get yourself so agitated, and everything that you did and said is not going to make any difference because of the delivery.
Yep.
That, you'll make so much of a more impact and difference when you talk to someone like a person, like a human that has their own backgrounds and their own experiences, and just understanding where can we find a common ground?
Right.
That's more important.
That's it. Well, Kae Lani, this has been awesome. Thanks so much again for the time and
Thank you.
Going deep down this rabbit hole of just dangerous conversation topics. You did great. No, I really, really, really appreciate all the perspective and the understanding that you brought to this. So much of this I had no concept for before, so it was really,
I hope that people, no matter how alone they feel in their unique experiences, feel empowered to come forward and say, you know what, my very unique background or position or whatever is worth listening to and is worth speaking up, and it will add to the conversation. That you don't have to be an archetype. You don't have to be definition of the LGBT person, or you don't have to be defined as a right-wing conservative. Everybody has these beautiful little differences in one another that makes it so much more, unique.
Yeah, you're not just a person, you're not just a group. You're a very complicated thing. You're a conglomerate of so many different experiences and your biology and history and all these things that come into who you are. Awesome. Peace out, everybody.